we are super excited because on this comic segment, if you remember, last time we were discussing Deep Space Nine comics produced by Malibu, issues 1 through 10. Now we're going to attack issues 11 through 20. We did mention that we saw one of our friends' names listed in the letters page. I mean, baby, weren't we excited to see Adam's name listed?
Yeah, that's so neat. Yeah, you're reading through the letters, and then it's like, oh, it's someone I know.
So guess what we did this time? We asked Adam to come on. Welcome, Adam.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I had totally forgotten about that letter. I knew that I'd had some in the DC Next Gen issues, and maybe one in the regular series issue. So thank you for having me.
And, you know, we've known each other for years. Adam, you still have your Deep Space Nine comics that we could reminisce through, too. Okay, so before we go into the comics, Adam, give us an idea. Where did you grow up, and how did you get into Trek?
I got into Trek in '82 thanks to Wrath of Khan. I don't remember where I saw it. It might have been at the Druid Hills Theater in Atlanta, Georgia, which is no longer a theater. I think it's a store of some kind. They turned the theater storefront into a storefront, but Wrath of Khan got me into it. I mean, I knew about the show. I'd seen the motion picture. I was a kid, but it was Khan that got me really into it because it was such a great movie, and also because I wanted to see the darn episode it was based on. And there was a local station showing it. You know, back in these dark times, we had UHF, so it was one of the UHF stations syndicating the show, and they'd show it every afternoon. So I'd get home from school or camp or what have you. It always seemed to me like they were showing the naked time, though. Like they never had any episodes except like a handful of ones that repeated. But I finally caught Space Seed and, of course, Trouble with Tribbles, and that is where my love for Star Trek took off. It was also during a time when Star Wars mania was at its peak following Empire Strikes Back, and I was a total Star Wars geek. And then, when Jedi came out, I was of a sensibility of, I don't know, this is getting a little schmaltzy between the Ewoks and the happy ending. I was expecting something more dramatic, Shakespearean, and intellectual, and I think Star Trek kind of filled that void. So I was, diehard Trekker from then on, with the movies, of course, Star Trek 4, even 5. I recently had an argument with people where I was defending 5 because I think it's very Trekish in a way. So when Next Gen came out, I was watching it weekly. I was defending it. It wasn't great, but it was pure Roddenberry, and I knew it would take off sooner or later, which it did. And, as Next Gen went on, I got even more excited for the series. I think, obviously, season 3 and 4 were the highlights and really the peak of when Next Gen took off. So when they introduced the concept of Deep Space Nine in this darker universe, and I hate that word darker. It's like Deep Space Nine is so much more than just being dark, but let's put that aside for a minute. Deep Space Nine was introduced and a lot of people didn't like it. I thought the intro, the first episode, Emissary, was phenomenal. It hit all the right notes by pulling in from Next Gen and all the threads from the Borg to the Bajorans, the cameo by Picard and what had happened between him and Sisko because of the Borg and Locutus. And then the series seemed to flounder because, as the saying goes, the station went nowhere. And a lot of people had that criticism, but I don't think what people recognize, what I didn't recognize, what a lot of people didn't, is it was laying the foundations for characters that were going to build and build over the course of seasons. And in addition to the action, in addition to the ongoing storyline, and it would become serialized, the first Star Trek serialized show, and lay the foundations for serial television as we know it today. So really, it was trailblazing. To segue into what we're going to talk about with comics, it's amazing to see how well the comics picked up on the characterization early thread, because I don't know, I could be wrong, but the writers might have been floundering with, well, what do we do? What kind of stories do we tell if we're on this station? They really dove into character. They got it pretty much from the get-go. So that's a little bit about me and Star Trek and where we're at.
That's awesome. Yeah, so starting with the Wrath of Khan, that's a great place to jump in.
science fiction films, because we're around the same age. I mean, it was just nonstop during that time. Science fiction, fantasy, action, adventure. I mean, that's why Starlog was so deeply embedded in our lives, because they were our internet for that time.
Yeah, I mean, I remember reading a lot of the early Starlogs through a friend is how I discovered it. And, a lot of the interviews were not just with media people, but with writers. You had Harlan Ellison in there. You had writers reviewing movies. You had writers talking about writing. And their coverage of Star Trek was immense. And you could get so much. I mean, you could get spoilers or you could just get interviews. I mean, that was the gateway. And it was a remarkable time. And that year of Con, 1982, there were so many great films. We did a panel on that many years back at Timegate, also known as Hulanta, where we featured the films of 1982, and it was a great look at Blade Runner and Khan and E.T., The Thing. I mean, it was a remarkable year for the imagination and for science fiction, as you say.
And as we jump forward to 1993, Malibu Comics, this was a magnificent time to be into Star Trek, because there was so much. It was virtually impossible to keep up with it all, with the comics, with the novels, with the shows.
I somehow did.
We did too.
Maybe because I was in college and I missed a few classes or something, but somehow we managed. So you did too? You kept up?
Oh, especially with the books. There was a point with both Kavura and I, we were devouring books. I mean, we didn't know each other back then, but that was one of our earliest conversations, is how much Star Trek media there was. There were Star Trek crossovers, the Playmates action figures, the phasers. It was just entire paychecks were going to Star Trek at that time.
I was going to say, you mentioned Playmates. I was going to say that's when it really arrived on the scene, because I think there was talk of how Gene Roddenberry had been jealous of the success of Star Wars and George Lucas and the merchandising. And when they started doing action figures on a regular basis, and then the offshoots for Deep Space Nine, the micro machines from Galoob, I mean, I was doing some teaching at the time. I was writing post college, but I was also doing some teaching of younger kids, like 3rd through 5th graders. They're playing with the Galoob toys, like the way you and I probably played with Star Wars toys, and that to me was when I knew that it hit the mainstream. I mean, I hate to talk about merchandising in Star Trek in that sense, because Star Trek is so much more, but it was big, and I don't think people realized how big it was, at that point. And we were spoiled. There was so much of it, but as you said, it was a really great time. I have fond memories of those years.
All right, so let's talk about Star Trek Deep Space Nine, Malibu Comic issue number 11, written by Charles Marshall, with art by Leonard Kirk and Bruce McCorkindale. This issue, the story was A Short Fuse. In fact, it's all about Jake and Nog helping the crew to find a bomb. What did you think about the story?
I'm going back to flip through because it's been a week or two since I reread it. First of all, the art in all the issues varies, as happens with series where you have different writers and whatnot. I like the art in this issue. I think it carried a balance of color that was true to the show, but also comic booky, but not in a way that was overly done, overly colorful. It had the tone. It had the tone of the show. There's some things with Odo where, they take certain liberties beyond what we saw in the show as far as what he can do transformation-wise. So to me, that was a little bit jarring. But I thought overall, the art was pretty good and had the flavor and feel of the show. The opening panel with Jake and Nog swinging and shooting was a great lead. And the bomb was something that they had inadvertently stumbled upon, and they were trying to be helpful to get rid of it, is what I recall from this. I think the humor, the characterization was captured very well of everyone. You can hear the dialogue. You can hear the actors in the dialogue.
See, I liked it because of the fact that they really understood. The writer, Charles Marshall, understood how teenage boys are, or preteen boys are.
Well, I thought that Jake and Nog, on Deep Space Nine, I think they really worked better as a B story, and I didn't really get into their story as much when they make them an A story. But the story overall was okay in this comic.
I agree with that totally.
Usually the B story, but putting them to the forefront was kind of what the series did later on, where we have these characters emerge, minor characters emerge and have episodes of their own. So it's interesting to note that the comic series was doing that, maybe out of necessity. Maybe there were certain things that they just couldn't touch on because this was the comic. Let's see, this was published July '94. So this was really in the midst of it would have been the second season of the show, if I remember correctly. And so they were, there were certain things they probably could do, couldn't do. And, to be able to deal with characterization like that of these minor characters is a neat thing. And to get the nuances down well. As far as the storyline goes, I think.
Yeah, they were still developing.
Yeah, I think that, it like we said, it has a funny ending. Is it predictable, perhaps? Is it a bit silly the way it's wrapped up quickly, perhaps? But it still has the flavor of it, and I think, like you said, it really captures the essence of these boys very well.
Or how about issue number 12? We are dealing with the same creative team, but this time the crew takes care of an abandoned baby.
The cover says it all. It's Quark holding the baby with the typical not bumper sticker, but window sticker you'd see in cars at that time with baby on board. It's a wonderful cover. And the look on Nog's face, you could just tell, it was one of mortification when he's holding the baby. It's comical genius. It got hits up in the letters pages for being just solid, funny, laugh out loud, where a baby is discovered abandoned on the station and gets passed from character to character. And you see the characters' reactions to things that is very much in keeping with what the characters would do, I think. I wouldn't say there's foreshadowing, but there's interesting things in retrospect with the series about there's a scene with Kira and Miles with the baby, which is interesting given what happens in season 5 with her being the surrogate. So again, there's no way the writers could have known this, but there's some nice echoes in here of things to come in the series, and I think the characterizations and the humor are captured very well. And that to me is what's interesting going back, because I'd forgot, like I said, I read these a long time ago. I'd forgotten about a lot of these issues, and going back and reading it, it's like this one in particular is like watching one of those episodes of the series, like Arman Bashir or one of the comedy ones, where it's not a lot of action. There's some elements to that, but it's mainly character driven, and I think it's fantastic. What did you think?
I thought the story was kind of silly, and I guess I didn't really expect that in a DS9 comic. I think so. I really didn't like the story as much as some of the others, but again, it was okay. And I guess maybe I didn't appreciate the humor as much as some people.
I think at the time, again, I think I remember reading these going, I'm really hoping for some big action-packed. Well, you're expecting more things to happen that are of intrigue and interest than just characters and a baby, But going back in retrospect now and looking at it in terms of the way the characters developed, there were episodes of the series that spent time on character storylines. And so this is like a snippet in the life, in between action and events on the series. But to me, it resonated well in keeping with what the series would become later. But then that's just my view. Obviously, it's not everyone's cup of tea.
What I think it's good about the series is that they did go back and forth, just like the series did. Because some people absolutely love the Ferengi episodes and others loathe them. But that's the whole point of the series is, in real life, there's going to be scenarios that are goofy and then some scenarios that are dramatic. So the comic series this Malibu series did a great job of that. And we were talking a little bit about the art. Let's think about the time period of 1994, where everything was hyper-muscular, with everyone being like a Rob Liefeld ripoff or a Jim Lee ripoff. I'm glad that they chose artists that understood how to draw characters just standing still, just sitting down, because that's what Star Trek is. If you look at the other contemporary series of that time, they made them like everyone was a superhero. And so the art choices here were excellent.
And then in independent comics of the time, there were certain stylistic things. You think about, the Liefels of the time, or the McFarlanes, and the way that things were going in the 90s, not just muscular heroes or, women in skimpy outfits with Witchblade style armor, but there was a certain look and feel to it. And this was much more in keeping with the realism of the show. Now, I'm looking at page 2. There's some artwork of Quark looking over the baby, and the perspective's a little skewed. So, it's not the most photoreal, but it captures the likenesses pretty well. I think that's a very valid point about how it, takes art in a direction that went away from what the 90s trends were. I want to jump back to something for a minute because I remembered something else. There was a flashback in here when Sisko's with the baby, flashing back to a scene with Jennifer and Jake as a baby. And to me, that's kind of the epitome of why I love this issue is, you mentioned the Ferengi episodes and how they're funny, and some people like them and some people don't. Some people don't appreciate the humor. The nice thing about this is this was Quark and the baby, but it was also him interacting with the crew and their reactions to it. And so when Sisko gets it from Odo, it is a moment where his inner experiences come to light, and we get to know him more and see more about him through this baby. When Odo gets the baby, he has it for so long that it starts to affect his metabolism, his composure. He can't keep it up forever, holding the baby. And there's a moment that's very Worf-like for him where you don't expect it, but he seems to really enjoy holding the child. And again, these are just great character moments. And so I'm jumping all over the place here, but looking at the art for this, expressions on Ben's face, on Jennifer's face, little Jake, it's very much capturing the joy of his memories there. So I enjoyed it all around, both the artwork and the issue itself.
Excellent. All right, issue number 13.
Yeah, so this was Odo, Lapse.
He's affected by a virus.
Affected by a virus. This was the hypodermic needle? Was this the one? This was the one where Bashir was going to give him the injection. He refused it at first and then agreed to it, and it caused it caused him to have a bad reaction, shall we say. So let me ask you a question. What did you think of Odo's shape-changing abilities in this issue?
I absolutely love it. And I think back to, because around this time, the Deep Space Nine novels were out. And if you remember, the Peter David wrote one called, it's The Something, like The Gift, The Chase.
The Siege?
The Siege, that's what
okay.
It was, yes. And I remember him, there was an article, it was either on Starlog or one of the probably Star Trek, the official magazine or something like that, where he said, one thing that I love writing for Star Trek on the literary side is I don't have to worry about a budget. I could turn Odo into anything. And it was at that time I said, that's totally true. And we see this in the comics. Because if you're a shapeshifter, you could be like the Wonder Twins. Anything at all. And so I appreciate the medium of comic books for that. We're able to see things that the show wish that they could do, but they don't have the budget for it.
Yeah. And there's definitely some elements in here where you can see that on 22 where he's falling, the imagery with the goo. I think the thing for me, though, and you mentioned The Siege, which was, I think, the first novel. It was the first Deep Space Nine novel. It was early on, and I don't know how much of the series or scripts have been shown to Peter David beforehand. I think I recall him saying that in an interview that he did not have access to much as far as what the characters were like. I could be wrong, but
I think you're right.
So I get the notion of it's a comic, let's play with it, let's expand it. And DC did this a lot, sometimes to great effect and sometimes not. Sometimes they took, they had enormous, space battles, things like that. Deep Space could do it too. But sometimes, the aliens felt more out of the milieu of Star Trek and into the writer's imagination, which is fine, but it becomes less Star Trek-y to me at that point. I think you have to be, for me, you have to draw a line between what fits into the Star Trek universe visually and what doesn't. And that's not to say you shouldn't have strange and exotic creatures that are imaginative. It's just certain things to me seem to step outside the lines of what would be Trek-ish. And for me, the main hesitation I have about this issue is Odo never really could develop his face accurately to be human-like or alien-like in the sense that so many details he could pass for somebody else, to my recollection. They have him imitating Brahm's face here, and that actually comes into play in a comic later on. But in the series, was there ever a point where he could imitate someone so well that he could pass for them?
No, because that was established. Yeah, exactly. That was one of the things that was established, that he had a hard time just with facial features.
Right. I mean, he says that in Emissary. He says that in the first episode, or somewhere early on in the first season. So to have that happen so early here was a little disconcerting because it goes against what his character can and can't do. I mean, I get it's the comics medium, and I like the fact that what he does here plays off later on in another issue. But again, for me, that kind of went outside the bounds of, well, this doesn't fit his character, and he can't do it in the series, so why is he doing it here? So for me, that kind of spoiled my enjoyment of the issue. But nevertheless, the storyline, I think, is an intriguing one.
Oh, I almost think it could be, you could explain it by saying that Odo was, he went mad, he went into this hysteria in this story, and maybe when he's in a different mental state, he's better at shape-shifting.
I think Odo only has one mental state. No, that's possible.
No, that was a true point. But absolutely, I agree with what you're saying. But you notice in the comic, he turns his fist into a sledgehammer. I mean, I could see him doing that, trying to tackle someone. Or he turned his fingers into claws in order to attack someone. These are little things that could have been done if the show's budget had allowed it. So I'm saying within that effect, and continuously through the series, when he does smaller things like that, I think it makes sense for the character. But total facial distortion, yeah, that's a bit of a stretch.
What's interesting, though, to go back to the milieu of the time, the art of the time, I mean, this obviously came out of the time when 2 years after Terminator 2, where we had morphing, and morphing in film and video became the thing. You have a character that morphs, so of course they're going to take advantage of it and do those things. So to see those things here, like you say, the arm and the hammer and stuff, that is not so disconcerting as the facial thing. I mean, it absolutely is taking on what he can and should be able to do. That fits his character and also fits that time. I mean, we don't really see CGI morphing, except in Terminator movies, the way we did then. It was overdone to a point. I think they use it sparingly and well enough with Odo. And they also established that he could very well mimic things, objects and birds and things that were indistinguishable. So to me, picking up on the morphing trend of the time and building a character around it was great, but it became less and less about that as a gimmick and more about him as a character. So as a character piece, I think this one, does work because it's the effects of what happens to him and what he goes through, and how the characters react to him when he's having this. And the ending is great too because of his line "No shots." It's a very, it's Odo. It's pure Odo. His sense of humor.
Totally. All right, let's talk about issues 14 and 15. This is a 2-part story entitled Dax Comet.
This one plays off of, and I think one of the later issues is too. This is coming after the second season, or maybe in the midst of the second season, where we established a lot more about the Bajorans. We had the Circle, And this one, this two-part, is very heavily focused on Bajor and a natural disaster or a space disaster that's going to happen that can threaten people. And it brings in some of the religious convictions of the Bajorans at odds with what is practical and what is right. And of course, Dax is the perfect character to throw into the mix of this. And I like the storyline. I wasn't as enamored with the artwork. It's a different team, I believe. Let me see.
Well, they had Terry Pallett with assists by Dennis De La Rosa.
Wait a minute. Were we looking at 14 and 15? Dax's comment?
It is... I'm sorry. It is... Yes.
And the same for both issues?
And then they had a variety of inkers.
Yeah. Yeah, Bruce McCorkindale, Moose Bogman, Barry Gregory. Yes, there are different inkers. And maybe that's why some things didn't flow. And it looks like there's different... Leonard Kirk is the penciler in the following issue. So maybe that's what the incongruity is for me here. Now, I will say, though, you mentioned how comics can open things up. One of the common jokes of Star Trek is Planet Hell. You know what I'm referring to when I say Planet Hell? The Planet Hell set?
The studio, I forgot what set number it was, but they called it Planet Hell because all the Planet episodes were filmed there.
Right. So anytime they're underground, it's the same set redressed. And you can tell it's a cave set or a planet set with the backdrop. What's remarkable about this is the opening, after the first page, we have some people going down in the cave. We have this remarkable shot of all these people listening to the Bajoran leader in a giant cave. It's almost reminiscent of that scene in the Matrix, the second Matrix movie, where it's just an enormous cavern that definitely takes the benefits of comics and opens up the atmosphere into this marvelous full page spread here. So the environments are remarkable and take advantage of that. The storyline itself, takes advantage of the rich tapestry of what had been established in season 1 and part of season 2 with the Bajorans. I think it actually succeeds. And what, to me, what's successful the most is it opens it up as a two-parter to let the story breathe and let the characters breathe. And this is much more intrigue, a lot more action, because we're dealing with characters facing off against these people who have a conviction. And that brings in conflict, which is what Deep Space Nine's all about.
It does seem like it was a good 2-part issue. The story fit 2 issues. I mean, it didn't seem like they had to add filler to spread out the story, which was good. And I like that they expanded on the Bajorans. They had this underground Bajoran religion. And it's one thing I think the comics may have done better than the TV show was on expanding on the Bajorans, because on the TV show, maybe because I had such high expectations for it at the beginning and some of the episodes kind of fell flat, but this one was a very interesting story.
Yeah, and it felt like the time. It felt like it fit in right with that season. I mean, that was the season that was taking chances with the 3-part opening to let the stories breathe a little. And I think you're right. By the way, I was mistaken. I was looking at the wrong issue for the second part. The second part was also it was penciled by Tim Eldred and inked by Bruce McCorkindale as well. So they had fewer inkers in part 2. Anyway, going back to this, I think being able to do that, like stick to one thread without a lot of B story, but keep things moving with this story and not have a lot of filler, have some character moments, but mainly deal with the storyline. To me, this is the point where the comic was starting to become more like Deep Space Nine than ever at that time. It was dealing with characterization and a lot more story tying into the overall arc. I mean, granted, the events of this are never referred to in the show, obviously, but like I said, you could easily see it slotting into the season, and it just fit. I think it's I think it's a well done 2-parter.
Totally agreed. Something we can't overlook are the ads. we were talking about why this era we were so broke as Star Trek fans. There's an ad for Leonard Nimoy's Primordials comics,
which I love, by the way. I love that series.
So that was the era when, do you remember Walter Koenig was getting involved in comics, and William Shatner's Tech War, he was involved in comics. It was just, everybody was trying to produce their own comic series.
Well, and funnily enough, I think Malibu with this series was really not the first, but the first to majorly undertake having people involved with the show come in and write and work for it, because they had a celebrity series. Mark Lenard, I think, wrote an issue. I know Aaron Eisenberg wrote an issue. Several of the actors came in and did stuff. Now, they did that with TNG. I know there was an issue of one of the TNG annuals that John Delancey co-wrote. I don't think he was happy with the final result, but I know he did it. There's, of course, the Walter Koenig story from the first DC series going back into the late 80s. But Malibu really kind of took that and ran with it, and then had celebrities come in and do the writing. So, going to what you said about Nimoy's Primordials, and we have to add with Isaac Asimov's concepts. We have to add that because they always had that mentioned there. But Shatner getting involved in writing, and Nimoy and all these other people, this was the time where these actors and these creators were branching out and doing other things and using their talents and their influence of Star Trek to expand those horizons, sometimes successfully and sometimes not. I mean, this was the time of Sequest and Stargate and Babylon 5. So, and where we saw a lot of cross-pollination of creators and writers and actors in all these series. But, some of the shows were strong and some were not, just as some of these comics were stronger and some were not. But I think it was great. It was great to see these people doing so much. And I'm going on a real tangent again. So please continue about the ads.
And did you notice the ad for the Hamilton collector's plates? Remember, that was all the rage during that time? Remember, that was all...
I see the board one. I see the card right here. It's got Locutus with the characters in it. Photo real, although I don't know that Data looks quite like Brent Spiner there, but I do love the artwork in those.
That's one of the fun things about we still physically buy comic books. And to physically go through the back issues, it's not just looking at the stories, it's remembering it's a pocket of time, everything else that we were doing. Because these ads marketed to nerds like us.
Which is what seems to be the case now with a lot of companies. Marvel's doing a series of dollar reprints of some of their classic issues. They're lead-ins to the trade collections, but they're great ways to go back and reread things from the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. I was just reading the introduction of Carnage today. And so where I'm going with this is it takes you to that snippet in time. Those issues don't reprint the ads, but they're doing something now called facsimile issues, which is reprinting in high-quality paper, high-quality printing, the issue as it was. So you could pick up Howard the Duck 1 now for $4.90 or $3.99, or you can pick up they did issue 50 of Star Wars, which led into the recent sequel they did to the Star Wars series, where it's a complete and utter reproduction of every page, every ad, every letter. And there is that kind of nostalgia now, and there is a market for that kind of nostalgia. So, yeah, going back and looking through these ads alone, I think you're right. It captures that snippet in time. Sometimes it makes me say, oh my gosh, like I'm looking now at this ad with this rock and roll stuff. Ozzy Osbourne. They got some Ozzy Osbourne comics advertised.
I was buying so many of those rock and roll comics.
Superman Doomsday video game. I mean, this was when the Super NES and Sega were competing. This takes me back. So it's memories. It's memory lane. It's awesome. It's awesome stuff.
All right, let's roll into issue number 16. Creative team, John Vordholt, Leonard Kirk, Richard Edmond, and Jack Snyder. So we're seeing some transition during this time period.
Yeah, we're seeing more single issue stories, different creative teams.
And look at the front page ad, Generations.
Well, of course, a Star Trek ad.
I mean, that was huge. That was huge. I mean, whatever you may think of the movie, it was a huge deal at the time to have the captains together. And yeah, I won't go into it too much, but the first 10 minutes, the opening with Kirk and the crew on the Enterprise B, is just great stuff. So I'm glad to see Star Trek movies preserved in Star Trek comics like this.
What do we think about the story? This is
a Quark story.
Odo Ezram, and this is where the what I mentioned earlier about Odo imitating Rom came in. So it's nice to see that thread carry through. The aliens reminded me a lot of the Pakleds, and I don't know if that's deliberate or not. I mean, they're not as slow, they're not as they're not quite the same, but it was the same type of storyline. So I kind of felt like, the criticism that's levied at a lot of Star Trek of the later series, like Voyager, is, well, they're just replaying the same storylines. So to me, this kind of felt like that, which is not to say it wasn't enjoyable. And to have the revelation of Odo, there too was good. But I don't know. I didn't enjoy it as much as the others, and I'll be frank in that I didn't enjoy a lot of the single issues coming up as I did the earlier ones we just talked about. But what did you think?
We said the same thing. It almost seems like the creative team tends to be tapering a little bit. Maybe they're worn out, stretched thin.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at the time period, November 94? When was this? The second series was running, started 93. I'm just trying to place this alongside the time frame of the series. And I'm trying to think of, how much of it could be that the comics, were just trying to put in filler, and how much they were trying to keep up with the series, what they couldn't do. It's hard to say. But I'm glad you agree. It seems like we're on the same page here, that they were really just, I don't want to say drop in quality, but drop in terms of interest. It's like they're just trying to keep things going and putting out issues without any real consistency. Although that's not entirely true. There's one or two that I liked in this group.
And we've been saying this because we keep up with the Star Trek comics. We tend to give writers a little bit more leeway when it's earlier in the series, because they're not giving a lot of information and they're actually given a lot of boundaries. Like, I really do feel bad for the writers of the Discovery comics that in such a short period of time, season 2 already has delineated some of the information in the Discovery comics, because they're not given direction. So when we do have issues from Deep Space Nine that are really hitting it out of the park, it's kind of amazing because they don't know where the characters are going. But then when you get ones like this where Rom just changes the entire signage of Quark's bar to Rom's bar, you're like, this is ridiculous now.
It's very 1990s though. It's schmaltzy. It's schmaltzy. What I was going to say about it also was...
But if you notice, there is an awesome ad for the Galoob Micro Machine Star Treks, and Kavora actually has the Star Trek Micro Machines on her bookcase. She was just looking at them today.
I still have a few of them. Here's something else. This is what I was saying before about the artwork. The ship is interesting. I don't know that shade of purple works. That seems to fit more of the Babylon 5 universe, which is nothing against Babylon 5. And it's not to say either that there can't be a purple hued ship in Deep Space Nine, but it doesn't fit the mood or the tone, shall we say, of the series. And granted, it's a lighthearted episode, so they can be a little more frivolous, but I think that's another thing too I noticed is the color palette kind of throws me off, because it gets away from those murkier hues that we're used to seeing in Deep Space Nine. The earlier issues that we just talked about had coloring, but it didn't stray too far off the beaten path from the tone established from Deep Space. I mean, every Star Trek series has its own tone, and part of that has to do with the look of the ships, the uniforms and whatnot, and part of it has to do with just, the characters and the mood.
Okay, we'll go on to the next one.
Let's talk about issue number 17, written by Laurie S. Sutton, pencils by Leonard Kirk, inks by Jack Snyder. Now, I'm going to tell you, I like this one.
Yeah, I like this one, too.
I like this one a lot. This was, we needed a fresh perspective. We needed her to come in and change course a bit.
I liked that. Yeah, Kira. It's very Kira focused. I like that it ties in. The dream sequence at the beginning ties in very nicely with what she really felt about Maritza. I like to see references like that carry through because it makes the characters more real. It's not like a one and done. That had a huge effect on Kira. I mean, that episode, Duet, was one of the, still is one of the strongest episodes of Star Trek. Not just Deep Space Nine, but Star Trek.
Always one of the most popular.
And the resonances of what it set up for Kira, what it set up for the Cardassians, what it set up for her relationship with the Cardassians and the turning point there. It's nice to see that played out and reflected here. I think the design, the feel of it feels very much like Deep Space Nine. And the dilemma, I think this. You mentioned earlier how some of the issues stand the test of time. This is one that stands the test of time because there's so much subtext in what happens to the guest character as a result of having to escape her situation. There's so much subtext that could be read that it could be metaphorical for a number of things. So I agree. I think this one as a standalone and as a Deep Space Nine story just hits the nail on the head. So, plus there's some cool ads for some cool video game controllers.
And notice there's a page in the back where if you want to have a pen pal. How cool is that? This is like the Facebook of 1994.
And that's, and that's the thing, recently you follow comics, so for a long time, some of the companies were doing away with the letters pages. Now, granted, not all of them would publish entire addresses, and not all of them did pen pals. But I got some really good pen pals out of some of the issues I was publishing, and to this day, I'm still friends with them. So to see this here actively doing it, and to see the letters pages, not in this issue, but in some of the others, where they're not just answering questions about the comic, but they went out of the way to say, here's how you can write to the fans or to the crew. Here's how you can submit your scripts. They really became, like you say, it was like a forum. It was like an online forum minus the online part. It's fascinating, and it really built a community within comics. It was one of the things I look forward to was seeing what people had to say, seeing the responses, and then being able to pick up an issue like this, look and say, hey, here's someone who lives near me. I'm going to try to write to them. Or, hey, here's someone in England. I'm going to write to them. And more often than not, I had people write to me. I had someone in England write to me because they liked what I had to say. This is about the Star Wars issue, obviously, because I don't think anyone responded to my Deep Space Nine one. But, I agree. I think it's fascinating. I'd forgotten all about them doing entire pages like this. But it's good stuff.
I remember the first time when I joined the Star Trek Well Committee, I was like in 5th or 6th grade, and I did that pen pal exchange thing, and I got a letter from a female. I didn't know what to do. I ripped it up, and I was almost afraid.
Yeah, too young for that.
I was like, I don't know what to say to a girl.
I made them. I was friendly with a girl, and I made the mistake of making a compliment about her photo or something, and I never heard from her again. Like, okay, I guess she didn't feel that way. Early ghosting through comics. How about that? But no, I give them a lot of credit. Like I said, the Dark Horse, I don't think published entire addresses. DC didn't. So for Malibu to go ahead and do this. Is really something. Actually, I guess I'm sorry, Dark Horse probably did because that's how people got in touch with me. But DC did not print entire addresses, to my recollection, which is not to knock DC. I have a lot of nice things to say about DC Comics run of TNG, especially as it was running concurrently at this time. And I know this is a bit of a tangent, but I want to say, for a long time that series had gone on since 89 or 90, and it was continuing all the way through the run of TNG. And I think the later issues from like 65 up into the end of the run really try to tie in and capture the flavor of TNG the same way that these Malibu Deep Space Nine comics did. And interestingly enough, this was the time that Malibu and DC crossed over and did the very first Deep Space and TNG crossover in a miniseries. I don't know if that something you've talked about before, going to talk about later, but I think it's important to mention that the first time we saw all the crew together, all of them together, was in this miniseries, 2 issues published by DC, 2 published by Malibu, and crossing over the writers and seeing that kind of collaboration open up so many possibilities for Star Trek.
What did you think about this issue, Baby Doll?
This is a good story. Like you mentioned, Adam, it had the great characters in this one. The way Kira reacted to the woman that was half Bajoran, half Cardassian, and what she had to go through, very similar to our feelings about Duet, and just the hatred between the Bajorans and the Cardassians, and how some of the Bajorans were not able to accept this woman, this half-breed. This was a very moving story and very much in line with a lot of the DS9 writing for the TV show that we came to know.
Absolutely. It was very, very much of Deep Space Nine's humanism. There's some really nice character touches, too. The scene with Odo trying to mimic her face and having the meal together, showing his kindness beneath his gruff exterior. There's just many moments in here that are defining for the characters and really what the series is about. And, it leaves things on a note of not even ambiguity. It leaves, things very much... We'll never know the true fate of this character, but we know she can't go back, and we know it's not even bittersweet. It's bitter in some ways because of the events. And that's the reality of Deep Space. It wasn't all tied up, in a bow, put away in a box at the end. There was a lot of ambiguity about characters and what happened to them. And I think this is single issue epitomized that feel of Deep Space very, very, very well.
There are a handful of comics that people who don't read comics that I say, okay, here's Watchmen, here's Sandman. There's a handful that we can all agree upon that elevate the medium to another level. When it comes to Star Trek comics, I have within almost every series, there's some, they miss the mark big time, but Gold Key especially. I mean, you have to just laugh at some of that stuff. But you could agree with there are just some outstanding comics that really hit the mark when it comes to, it could possibly be canon Trek because it's so good. And this is one of the issues that I would hand to someone that's hesitant about reading Star Trek comics, that loves Star Trek, saying this is the medium of comics and how awesome Trek could be in there.
Yeah, I think you make a really good point, and I think there's a number of reasons for it. I mean, we mentioned that it ties back to an earlier pivotal episode. It has great character scenes. It has humanism. The artwork is very much in keeping with the tone. There's so many things for going for this, and a single issue alone that really pack a punch. So, I mean, I would agree. I think, if someone were to say, well, what's a Deep Space Nine comic like? I think you're right. I think this is definitely one to show them.
And we have the same writer, Laurie S. Sutton, for issue 18, entitled Hearts of Old.
Dax. So, same writer, but it's still Leonard Kirk during the penciling here. There was something about the artwork I wanted to say. Still Snyder. So they have a couple. Yeah, the issue 17 was just Snyder alone inking. This one has 3 inkers, actually. It has Jack Snyder, Richard Amond, and Larry Welch. And that may be the reason, to me, the artwork varies, is the inking. I think inkers don't get enough credit. They really don't. And colorists, too. You think, you're just coloring the lines, or you're just tracing over something that's drawn, the penciler does all the work. That's not true. Inking can make or break it. And I'm not saying, the inking here is bad at all. I'm just saying that I don't know that the style meshes as well. So I think while the storyline works, I think for me, the artwork kind of throws me off. And I know that's a superficial thing to say, but comics is a visual medium. And if there's not consistency, people notice. So that's just my first reaction.
I totally agree with you, because that being a visual medium, you do notice without even looking at the credits that all of a sudden now there's lack of depth, or lack of texture on certain pages, and then it goes back. And so I realized that Star Trek comics a long time ago, their pattern is they tend to get their A-listers early on, and then they taper off a little bit for cost reasons. And that's not just Star Trek comics, that's all comics. And then they tend to revitalize it at a certain point by bringing in an A-lister again. That's the comics industry.
Yeah. As far as the story, I mean, it's common, especially with a character who has multiple past lives, to bring in characters that they know, or in this case, had a relationship with. It's kind of contrived in a way, and I think there's a lot of good things going on here with that. But to me, this would have benefited from opening up into maybe a two-parter. I think things felt very compressed. The storyline about Gwyn and the relationship to Dax. I think there's a lot going on that could have been fanned out with some more character moments and let the action play out more instead of feeling rushed.
Well, I think it is rushed because you have this pointless backup story in the back.
Oh, the intro to Voyager that was in the back?
It's called Wargames.
Yeah, they're interesting because that's the only time Voyager, I think, appears in, or it's probably the first time Voyager appears in comics, at least they mention Chakotay. So what, they're cramming in, looks like they crammed in the story and then left space for the Wargames story?
That's totally what they did because it's not a giant size issue.
And it's interesting because it's not even advertised on the front that there is a story that ties into Voyager. The last panel says the adventure continues in the new television series. You'd think maybe they were going for the element of surprise for you, but you think they would want to, launch into that more and get more buyers and more interest by throwing it on the cover. I could be wrong. What I will say, though, is that the mini piece here about the Voyager Wargames by Mark Altman, I have a lot of respect for Altman as a writer. He also does a lot of criticism, as you're probably aware. He did from Sci-Fi Magazine, which he published in the 90s. Very opinionated stuff. Got him in trouble with some of the production crew. And I don't know that this mini, this 4-part comic in the back of this issue was a good representation, but some of the miniseries he did, the Maquis, he did one about, what's it called? I got it right here. I had it right here. He did the single issue, the 0 issue, Tarek Noor, which is the background of the station, which is a great piece. So I think his writing's very good. I just think this issue that we're talking about, number 18, doesn't do Sutton any favors and doesn't do Altman any favors by compressing these two stories into a single issue and not letting them breathe. So it's a shame because they're both very good writers, very talented. And there's a lot of things going on here that could have been promoted more and developed more as stories.
What I thought, I actually enjoyed this Dax story. Maybe it's because it was just coming off. I had just read The Lives of Dax. But what I like about this, it makes so all through the story, you're suspicious of her friend, the other Trill, and then and there's this twist at the end where he's really a good guy. I just thought that was a very good twist at the end. And I also like the Klingon woman companion. It was just neat to see her in a story, just to have a Klingon as a background character.
And I agree. I enjoyed the story. I totally enjoyed the story. I just wish it would have gone on longer.
Yeah, there were a lot of things going on at once. To go back with what you said about having a Klingon, this was obviously 2 years or a year and a half before Worf. The idea of bringing Worf, and the Klingons in more was even entertained. And that obviously changed the focus of the show. I think people might have been more welcoming of the series had it had more of the traditional Trek elements in it from the beginning. It had a lot of elements from TNG, like, the Borg, obviously, and the Bajorans and the Cardassians. It really kind of stayed away from Klingons for a lot of the time until season 4. So I agree. Having some of those more familiar aliens here with interesting characterization and backstory was great. But I also agree there was so much crammed in so little that it just could have been dealt with a lot better.
But we do end the comic with another advertisement, this time for Gene Roddenberry's Lost Universe. And guess what? We've been praising the artwork on how more realistic the art was. Well, it looks like the 90s are still there in Gene Roddenberry's Lost Universe.
The 90s are here because we've got this big muscular dude with the arms bursting, the muscles bursting out of him. The women with the spandex, but the cleavage and the armor, kind of Witchblade type armor, and lots of flashes of light and lasers and other things. So very 90s. Now, I never read Lost Universe, and I never watched Andromeda either, which was the series based on Roddenberry's ideas. Were you guys familiar with it? Did you watch it at all?
Yeah, I did watch Andromeda, at least for the first few seasons, and I enjoyed it. I liked it a lot. I just think later on it got more convoluted with more characters, and it seemed like I think it lasted a few seasons more than it should have, but it was good in the beginning.
Does it carry through? Because obviously, I mean, Roddenberry had passed in 91, so his name is on the series. Do you feel it carried through his vision of things? Because whatever Roddenberry did, whether it was Star Trek or Quest or tapes, there was a kind of through line in terms of his philosophy that came through. Do you think it came through in those series, or was this just a company kind of taking up his name and ideas and using it, or maybe a bit of both?
Yeah, it had some of his ideas. But yeah, it wasn't as hopeful as like that kind of message, but it did have a good message about humanity, that we can survive anything. But the show did take place right after the fall of a great empire, so it was about rebuilding a great empire, but it did have the thoughtfulness.
What's interesting about that is how Roddenberry had been so resistant to the idea of the nihilism and the cynicism, and Trek was always the antidote to that, to have a vision of the future where people could thrive and explore, and he'd emphasize little conflict, which caused story writers no end of problems, but it's a very different view. So what you're describing to me sounds a lot like Deep Space Nine in that sense, and I'm kind of wondering, what do you think Roddenberry would have thought of Deep Space Nine from beginning to end? Because a lot of people now, and I feel this way too, despite all the cosmetic differences and the quote unquote darkness of it and the serialization, to me there's so much Trek in it, and of the philosophy and the humanism, that it really, to me, goes back to what Star Trek's all about, maybe more so than Next Gen.
I mean, so many people have asked that, like, what would Gene have thought of the show? I mean, on the surface, you would think that it's very different. I mean, I think Gene would have to like give it a watch, like, binge watch it from beginning to end, and then his opinion would probably be, yes, I love it. But at first, you do kind of think, no, this isn't Star Trek, but it is once you dig into it and find out that it really is about the human adventure. Even though it has all these aliens, even though it is about war, it's still very, very hopeful about the heart and about what we can do, how we get along, how we deal with each other in these circumstances. I mean, yes, like you said, it's very much Star Trek.
And it's obviously rubbed off in some ways on the later series, to some degree, Enterprise, but more so now, I think, with Discovery. And I'll be frank, I know very little about Discovery. I have not tuned in, and then people keep saying, why aren't you watching it? I'm going to get to it, I promise. But the thing to me that's appealing about it is you're doing these shorter seasons, concentrated storylines that carry through in a serialized way. That's what Deep Space did, and that's what it did well. And be able to follow characters' adventures and see them grow and change and carry on that human experience is what Star Trek's all about. So it's interesting to see how it's influenced, series since its time. Anyway, we're going on a tangent here. I'm looking at the back of that last issue of 18 and seeing Clive Barker's Lord of Illusions. I'd forgotten all about that one. Although I loved Hellraiser. They were pumping out Hellraiser movies back then.
Issue number 19. Dan, now we're switching to Dan Mishkin writing. Art by Ken Penders with Arn Starr. So we're going back to old school DC inker with Arn Starr. Once I saw his name, I was excited. Because I really do love that first volume of DC Star Trek comics. I was getting it from issue 1, continuing on with it. It filled that void between Star Trek The Wrath of Khan and The Search for Spock. It showed us what was going on.
But I think they handled it well. They acquitted themselves well. And I love those issues too. The first, and even the Mirror series that they did post Star Trek 3, I think is phenomenal stuff. There, and of course Peter David's run on that series too. There are a lot of awesome things in DC's first Trek series. Absolutely.
So we're going, yeah. Oh, I totally agree with you. But the art here, we're noticing the difference with the inker. I love this issue.
To me, I hate to be the bad guy, but to me, there was nothing really stand out about it, and it's interesting that Starr was doing this as the inker, even though not the penciling. The aliens are very reminiscent of some of the DC aliens, which is fine. It's not to say that they shouldn't, have that look. It shouldn't have this feel, this coloring. It seemed to feel more like, as you say, old school DC than Malibu Deep Space Nine. And again, that's not necessarily a criticism. It's just different. It's different than what I expected to see at this, but it definitely is a throwback to that.
I think I would have liked it better if it was on pulp paper instead of this glossy paper, because the colors are just too vibrant.
Well, this one had the very interesting artwork. Yeah, the drawings of the aliens, they look, like they're humanoid, but then they're also very alien looking. I thought they were very creative in that.
They have ridges.
Yeah, they do, which is good.
Gotta have ridges. For fans of Bashir, I noticed we have Bashir in his swimsuit. We have an interesting dynamic of Cisco and Bashir, because if you recall from the early episodes, he annoyed the crap out of Cisco. He annoyed the crap out of a lot of people. So it's nice to see that they're doing the kinds of things that Deep Space would do quite a bit, which is take characters and put them together in a situation and see what sticks and see how they react, not just to their situation, but to each other. So it's always fun to see a mix of characters like that, where you take them away from the crew, stick to, and see what happens. But to be frank, I don't really remember much about the story.
Well, I like this story because it takes Cisco and Bashir. They're being treated by alien doctors with obviously a different set of organs and placements, and so they have to kind of talk them through human anatomy. But it also gives us a little bit of Dr. Bashir's history.
Of schisms, and I think there's a DC issue. It may have been the Schisms Alien or may not be, but it's a very similar cover of a Next Gen issue that has this. I guess it's a common trope too, the people on the medical beds with the aliens hovering over them. It's a nice cover though. It's definitely it intrigues me. I wish the story did as well. On the other hand, there's some really cool Sega Genesis artwork on the back. Sorry, I know I'm not being helpful about this one, but this issue just did not. It didn't do anything for me.
So what these comics do is have there's one that they focus on a different character each time. So we had a Dax and Akira and Odo. So this is a Bashir story, and it was pretty interesting the way they did it. Using flashbacks with Bashir, he remembered another time that he was in med school, I think it was. I thought that was neat the way they did that. And the story overall was okay. I don't think it was bad.
I was glad to have an issue with Bashir because we've had such a long stretch with him being ignored for a while. So I was glad to see more character development with him.
This is the one where I said, wow, this is definitely a Trek comic because it's very dependent on technobabble. But I mean that in the nicest possible way. This is the science fiction issue. This is the one where they have to solve a problem using their intellect and their tools and their technobabble. So, why don't you start? Last Remains. It's Dan Mishkin, writer, and Ken Penders, Jack Snyder as inker, as pencil and inker, with ink assists by David Mallory and Scott Reed. But even with the assists, there's I don't know what's the word I'm looking for. Not conformity, but there's consistency to the artwork. I don't feel that anything's really out of place. So
the artwork all looks pretty good. What I remember is like it. So it had the Romulans, and it brought out the idea that they use a singularity in their ships, and that's how they use their warp propulsion. And then, after reading this, then I looked it up and found out, I mean, yes, it has been mentioned in Star Trek before. For some reason, I just never noticed it before, that they don't use, dilithium crystals or anything that what we're more familiar with. They create a singularity on their ship.
So they actually have done that, and I mean, it may not be mentioned, but you're saying that this is consistent with known lore about Romulans?
Yeah, yes, it has been mentioned before in various ways, yes. But beyond that, as far as the rest of the story, I didn't get into it as much because it was a lot of technobabble.
Way too much.
I mean, yeah.
But at the same time, there is the danger to Bajor. There's the danger to the wormhole. And I think, bringing Romulans in is interesting because we didn't see them until third season. So this kind of whets the appetite of a Deep Space Nine reader to go, oh, they are part of this tapestry. I agree about the technobabble and the solution, the way they had to kind of reverse engineer things to solve the problem. But this might have made an interesting little bottle show. I can kind of see it as a bottle episode of the series that would, throw a bone out to traditional fans with the Romulans and still meet the requirements of deep space. It's not particularly outstanding, but it's not the worst I've seen with technobabble. It's not like anyone's turning into a lizard man or anything.
Oh no, at least not that. Yeah.
I'm a fan though of physics, even if it's completely wrong physics, and anything involving quantum mechanics, black hole singularities always fascinates me. So I guess I have a soft spot for it.
Hey Adam, we want to thank you so much for spending time reminiscing about Deep Space Nine comics in the early to mid 90s. We look forward to seeing you. I think the next con we're going to see you as Dragon Con.
I will definitely be at Dragon Con. I'm sure I'll see you at the Trek Tracks or probably one of the many other places. Cheers to the 90s. Cheers to Deep Space Nine. And cheers to you guys for having me on.
Thank you so
Adam.
much.
So next episode, we're going to conclude our discussion of the Malibu run of comics. That is the continuous numeric series. We're going to start with issue number 21.
Thanks for listening. Make sure you hit that subscribe button and join our Facebook group. Live long, and may the Force be with you. Nanu Nanu.